Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women and the Politics of White Supremacy by Elizabeth Gillespie McRae. Narrated by Kirsten Potter. Introduction. Segregation's Constant Gardeners. When the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, a young white mother near Wilmington, North Carolina, received the news with resolve to circumvent the ruling using nerve and plenty of hell in the personality. Mrs. Hugh Bell organized the Pender County Association for the Preservation of Segregation and spent the summer circulating a petition to continue segregated schools no matter the consequences. By August, the association had obtained nearly 5,000 signatures, representing over one-third of the county's white population, and an association member delivered it to the governor of North Carolina in October. The next summer, Bell tried to rally newspaper editors and segregationists across the state. In a letter to the Raleigh News and Observer, Bell explained her commitment to school segregation as an attempt to protect her two little girls and to secure states' rights. She intended to put her typewriter to use for the cause. For others, she wrote, "Maybe it will take a little violence," glibly noting that it was too bad about the murder of the 14-year-old Negro boy, but wondered if this could be only a mild beginning. Included with the letter was the lengthy New Hanover County Preliminary Report, which she had helped to compile and distribute. Filled with questionable quantitative and anecdotal evidence, the report cataloged the deleterious effects of school desegregation, predicting the decline of the family, the schools, the state, and the nation. It acknowledged parental fears that their white daughters would marry someone's black sons, and that academics would suffer as black students with low IQs and high sex drives diminished the education of white students. These problems would be compounded by the Negro teacher, who, subjected to subversive propaganda, sees the world in a way antagonistic to the white philosophy of life. These malignant consequences would ripple across the nation, the report predicted, as integrated schools fulfilled the wishes of communists and infiltrated the minds of America's youth with a one-world doctrine. In one way, Bell's segregationist moment fits well with the familiar story of massive resistance told in textbooks, documentaries, and scholarly works. In that story, white Southern opposition to the civil rights movement rises and coalesces in the decade after the Supreme Court's decision when segregationists insisted on separate schools. Pledging to avoid school integration at all costs, newspapermen and politicians named the movement Massive Resistance. Then, in 1956, echoing the desires of their constituents, 101 Southern members of Congress signed the Southern Manifesto, a proclamation to resist forced integration by any lawful means. To legitimize their rejection of the constitutional principle of federalism, congressmen and segregationists revitalized, for a post-World War II world, the antebellum precept of interposition, which held that state legislatures could intercede between the federal government and citizens of their individual state, nullifying federal laws that threatened their residents. About the same time, citizens' councils, made up of middle-class white professionals, mostly men, who ostensibly scorned the lowbrow Ku Klux Klan, KKK, spread across the South to circumvent desegregation specifically and racial equality generally. In the 1960s, Southern governors, George Wallace, Lester Maddox, and Ross Barnett, further galvanized massive resistance by standing in schoolhouse doors, by ranting racist ideologies on the campaign trail, and by calling on states to eliminate support for public education in their constitutions. Bell's prediction of violence came to fruition in the murder of 4 little girls in a Birmingham church, mobs hurling fists and insults at young men and women at Woolworths counters and elementary schools, and policemen turning their hoses, dogs, and billy clubs on civil rights activists and bystanders. Massive resistance, the well-told story has reminded us, was short-lived. In the face of the grassroots activism of black Southerners and their allies, the reluctance of white moderates to abandon public schools, and the economic concerns of the South's businessmen, Bell's Pender County Organization and Citizens' Councils eventually disbanded, and the efforts of the powerful, the Wallaces and the Barnetts, faded. Helped along by the nation's outrage at the killing of young black and white activists, moderation gradually replaced massive resistance. Meanwhile, the State Department pressured the executive branch to support desegregation and black voting rights in order to augment the nation's Cold War agenda and counter damaging stories of the nation's racist violence covered by the communist press. Total defiance, the position of the hardline segregationists, gave way to token compliance, the position of most white moderates. By the mid-1960s, faced with the Black Freedom Struggle, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and Baker versus Carr, massive resistance met defeat, and its advocates moved to the political margins. The South's segregationists lost, and the Southern political landscape shifted. Bell's activism, however, also points to some flaws in this familiar conceptualization of massive resistance. In the summer of 1954, petitions carrying the signatures of more than 80,000 North Carolinians spoke to a widespread sentiment among local people who did not rely on governors, senators, or political party machinery to direct their immediate and organized opposition to school integration. Bell's plea for North Carolina to reject the Supreme Court decision predated by more than a year the call for interposition made by the editor of the Richmond News Leader, James Kilpatrick. Support for the segregated state existed among everyday people. Maintaining racial segregation was not solely or even primarily the work of elected officials. Its adherents, like Bell and her association, sustained the system with quotidian work and organizations that reached beyond the KKK and the Citizens' Councils. On the ground, it was often white women who shaped and sustained white supremacist politics. The anti-integration arguments that Bell and others employed had broad and deep roots across the South and the nation. They did not debut in 1954 as a reactionary response to the Supreme Court's decision. Political support for racial segregation was generations in the making, which suggests that truncating massive resistance to a decade obscures its political evolution and renders its activists reactionaries. The New Hanover document that Bell distributed drew on stories from both in and outside the South, pointing to the presence of a national network of committed segregationists. The document also spoke to the multiple locations where racial segregation had been and would have to be maintained: dating etiquette, teacher training, public health policies, sexual customs, civic organizations, and in the stories people told. Federal legislation could hardly combat segregationist practices in places that lay far below legislative halls, judicial chambers, and voting booths, nor could a chronology of massive resistance that relied solely on federal legislation, judicial decisions, and violent uprisings capture how the daily, mundane, and local resistance to racial equality persisted. Finally, in Bell's defense of segregation were elements that addressed more than the South's legalized racial divide and formed the foundation of a broader political platform informed by the Cold War, communism, housing policies, federal aid to education, tax reform, and calls for limited government. This book is about that story, the story of grassroots resistance to racial equality undertaken by white women. They are at the center of the history of white supremacist politics in the South and nation. While they toiled outside the attention of the national media, for the most part, white women took central roles in disciplining their communities according to Jim Crow's rules and were central to massive resistance to racial equality. White segregationist women capitalized on their roles in social welfare institutions, public education, partisan politics, and popular culture to shape the Jim Crow order. From there, they provided a political education that mobilized generations and trained activists for white supremacist politics. These women guaranteed that racial segregation seeped into the nooks and crannies of public life and private matters, of congressional campaigns and PTA meetings, of cotton policy and household economies, and of textbook debates and daycare decisions. Their work shored up white supremacist politics and shaped the segregated state. White women were the mass in massive resistance. At times, their political activism connected them to a national network of white segregationists. Far from being regional retrogrades and outsiders in the nation, the South's female segregationists participated in the same eugenics movement that social workers in Southern California did. Protests against Social Security joined segregationists in Texas with anti-income tax advocates from Massachusetts. In the 1950s, coalitions opposing the United Nations welcomed Mississippi's female segregationists, who made political alliances with right-wing West Coast anti-communist organizations. When female segregationists called for limits on the Supreme Court in the aftermath of Brown, they received support from conservative organizations in Chicago and Seattle. In a Jim Crow nation, segregation's female activists imbued women's civic duties, womanhood, and motherhood with particular racist prescriptions. For many, being a good white mother or a good white woman meant teaching and enforcing racial distance in their homes and in the larger public sphere. In the 1970s, the anti-bussers of Boston echoed earlier activists for massive resistance when they ignored the persistence of structural racism, elevated individual rights, and made sacrosanct the rights of families to determine their children's public education. Decade after decade, the South's female segregationists were part of the widespread political mobilization of American women. To uncover this reconceptualized history of massive resistance, the lives of 4 educated, politically active women from North Carolina, Mississippi, and South Carolina form the narrative anchor of this book and offer a long trajectory on white supremacist politics. The public lives of Nell Battle Lewis, Florence Sillers Ogden, Mary Dawson Cain, and Cornelia Dabney Tucker paralleled the reign of Jim Crow segregation and were part of a broad and massive network of women across the South and the nation who now populate this story. Their prodigious correspondence exposed the work of the lesser-known and the fleeting, like Mrs. Bell, and the better-known and well-connected, like conservative activist and Barry Goldwater acolyte Phyllis Schlafly. It exposed a network of female segregationists that included old and young, college-educated and high school dropouts, career women and homemakers, urbanites, suburbanites, and rural residents. These women were married and single, childless and mothers. They were staunch Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Some were all 3. Their formal and informal network stretched from the rural environs of the Black Belt South to the right-leaning West Coast city of Pasadena, from the bastion of Southern liberalism, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, to Boston's working-class Irish neighborhood, South Boston. The Jim Crow South, where Lewis, Ogden, Cain, and Tucker worked with their Southern segregationist sisters, was one expression of a larger, more diverse Jim Crow nation. A nation where garden club members and stay-at-home moms joined newspaper columnists and school teachers in reifying the color line. Nell Battle Lewis was a single woman with a caustic tongue and a Mencken-like pen who wrote for the Raleigh News and Observer from 1920 to 1956. Born to one of North Carolina's leading families, she left the South to be educated in the North and returned as a career-minded, progressive iconoclast to begin her newspaper career from the urban environs of Raleigh. A Southern liberal in the interwar period, she moved into the Cold War as one of the central architects of North Carolina's campaigns against racial equality. On the eve of her death in 1956, she celebrated knowing that resignation to the court's Brown decision had morphed into a broad resistance against desegregation. Born on a cotton plantation along the banks of the Mississippi River, Florence Sillers Ogden remained in Rosedale, Mississippi, with her Chicago-born husband on her family's land. A member of the rural black belt elite, Ogden filtered her politics through the lenses of the old plantation class and the modern agriculturalist. She shifted seamlessly between working with white women in the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR, and powerful white male landowners in the Delta Council, an economic lobby for the region's cotton growers. In the 1960s, she looked to Chicago as well as Jackson to build membership for the newly formed segregationist organization Women for Constitutional Government, WCG. All the while, from 1937 to 1982, she authored Dis and Dat, a How to Preserve White Supremacy column in Hodding Carter's Delta Democrat and later the Jackson Clarion Ledger. From the New Deal until the Reagan era, Mary Dawson Cain was owner, publisher, and columnist of Pike County, Mississippi's The Summit Sun. Located in the Piney Woods region bordering Louisiana, Cain's hometown was in timber country. Married to a gas station owner, Cain had her own career and went to the office every day to put out her weekly paper. She was also a kind of conservative everywoman, working with political activists from Massachusetts to California to defeat prohibition, end Social Security, and oppose civil rights legislation. As a conservative among conservatives and a woman among men, she first ran for governor in 1951. She kept up her newspaper and her conservative crusades until her death in 1984. In the 1920s, Cornelia Dabney Tucker was widowed with 4 children and left in a financially precarious position in Charleston, South Carolina. Apolitical early, in 1937 she began a national campaign to oppose Roosevelt's court-packing plan and did not stop her efforts to shape the Supreme Court until her death in 1970. By World War II, she called herself the first Republican Southern Belle and spent much of her time looking north to the investors, vacationers, and businessmen who came to her hometown of Charleston to help her craft a politics that served a segregated South. She built relationships with Republican women in New England and the Midwest, and at the same time she cultivated a long-lasting political partnership with the rabid segregationist senator from Mississippi, James Eastland. In 1938, she left the Democratic Party, worked to build a lily-white Republican Party, and then vacillated in her partisan loyalties before moving permanently into the New Right in the 1950s. Her political work pointed to early fissures in the Solid South. Broadly, the work of female segregationists occurred in 4 areas: social welfare policy implemented at a local level, public education, electoral politics, and popular culture. The household production of white supremacy coalesced around the efforts by white women to police the relationships and racial identities of their neighbors. To maintain the color line, they drew on evidence gathered from their work as registrars, social workers, and teachers, and provided by local knowledge, local history, and even rumor. In part, they linked the domestic and intimate matters of sex, marriage, childbirth, and child-rearing to white supremacist politics. Noted Southern author Lillian Smith recalled that when her mother taught her to love God, to love our white skin, and to believe in the sanctity of both, she was performing a political act within the intimate confines of the family. Some of the lessons about segregation taught to black and white children were powerful and private, but they were not always private. In the 1920s, white women assumed new roles in the body politic that allowed them to police physical and familial ties between black and white Americans. White supremacy became bureaucratized in a new social welfare infrastructure, and white women regulated intimate matters with the legitimacy of state sanction. In doing so, this new cadre of female workers translated their gender-specific authority as white mothers into public authority as workers for the state. White women also used public education to ensure that generations of children would be schooled in white supremacist politics. Just as black women understood that schools could be a place to counter the lessons of Jim Crow, white women crafted their own version of citizenship education for a Jim Crow world. As Catherine Charon's work on Septima Clark has shown, the school as an institution proved essential to the maintenance of white supremacy, and white women provided lessons on the benefits of racial segregation and the work needed to keep it going. When white women censored textbooks or movies, funded summer schools, or conducted essay contests, they upheld segregation through a broad public education that outlasted both legal segregation and its most vociferous proponents. Suffrage moved white women undeniably into electoral politics, where they could use the weight of their votes to shape the worlds in which they lived. They worked in primaries and party conventions. As partisan actors, they canvassed neighborhoods, registered folks to vote, and volunteered at the polls. Some even ran for office. Building on their local networks, electoral politics allowed segregationist women to parlay their grassroots political work into state and national policy. Using their votes and voices, they challenged national party platforms, organized the ouster of office holders who did not adhere to their segregationist vision, and mobilized their constituents to rally against domestic and foreign policies that they believed could erode the economic, political, and cultural power of Southern whites. They built political platforms that translated political support for white supremacy into broader debates on national sovereignty, genocide, and the fate of developing nations. In the process, they boiled down communism, the rise of the United Nations, and decolonization into the substance of daily life, and then offered instruction in how to combat those forces by watching out for what their children learned, whom they married, and even how they trick-or-treated. White supremacist politics was also produced at the level of culture, where the stories white women told reinforced the Jim Crow order. White women perpetuated customary segregation through a broader creation of a popular culture that constructed and celebrated white ethnicity as superior and separate from black ethnicity, and that reified black stereotypes. Again and again they employed their culture talk to remind Southern whites of the benefits and privileges of white society. They also offered public commentary on the appropriate place of black people in American society, celebrating the black vernacular while diminishing black accomplishments in politics, high culture, and intellectual endeavors. If black Southerners were not named as often in the other areas of the production of white supremacy, they occupied central roles in white supremacist popular culture, as mammies, field workers, happy-go-lucky men and women, and manual laborers. Despite white segregationist women's ubiquitous political work, scholars of massive resistance and Southern segregation have rarely confronted them. Beyond New Orleans's cheerleaders or Little Rock's Mothers League, the white Southern women who have more often been studied were supporters of the civil rights movement. The politics of Virginia Durr, Anne Braden, white Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee workers, and Little Rock's Women's Emergency Committee, for example, have garnered scholarly attention. The women who censored public school textbooks, raised money for the Civil War Centennial, encouraged their children to participate in essay contests, and formed or joined segregationist organizations have, until recently, remained on the outskirts of the story. The reasons for this are twofold. In part, the scholarship has adopted a more top-down examination of massive resistance that focused on laws, congressmen, state legislators, and violent episodes covered by a national media. Recent studies of Jim Crow segregation, however, have taken a more local view and examined how white supremacist politics and Jim Crow laws manifested themselves in communities as diverse as Miami, Florida, rural Mississippi, and northern Virginia. But white women have often remained bit players. Frequently, when white segregationist women have entered the historical narrative, their politics have been explained as either a result of an inherent racism or of their capitulation to patriarchal power that defined their lives, hiding their political independence. In contrast, conservative women outside the South have had their gender-based, class-based, and culturally derived aspects of their politics plumbed in order to explain how they contributed to the rise of anti-radicalism, anti-communism, and the New Right. Their racial politics, a politics often very much akin to that of their Southern sisters, however, has been treated as an aberration or a side note of a more legitimate political platform. As a result, the term segregationist, often freighted with a host of rural, retrograde, demagogic, and masculine meanings, has been reserved mostly for white Southerners, disguising both the sophistication and breadth of white Southern women's political work, and by consequence, the connections they cultivated with white supremacists nationwide. It often has also spared white conservative women the label of white supremacist. These scholarly gaps have disguised our ability to see white segregationist women's systematic and nationwide support for racial inequality and the dogged persistence of white supremacist politics, policies, and cultural practices in the decades before and after the Civil Rights Movement. Focusing on segregationist women as grassroots activists in social welfare policy, public education, partisan politics, and popular culture reframes the story of massive resistance in several ways. First, white women's work exposes massive support for racial segregation that began long before Brown and stretches past its legislative dismantling in the 1960s. No longer limited to the years between Brown and the Voting Rights Act, massive resistance looks less like an agenda of reactionaries and more like a long-lived, sophisticated political program. Rooted in the South, massive support for various Jim Crow systems never stays put, but sends out its activists and its ideas to already active hosts across the nation. The grassroots organizing of white segregationist women becomes part and parcel of the 20th century political mobilization of women, linking massive resistance to political movements beyond the South's geographic boundaries. In the era of women's rising political activism, the longer movement of massive resistance was, for many women, their entrance into public politics and connected some of the South's leading female segregationists to post-war conservative activists. Instead of a defined moment or movement, massive resistance emerges as a kind of overarching defense of a white supremacist regime regularly reproducing support for racial segregation. It is a program that could be national in its reach, but local in its practice and prosaic in its work. By looking at white segregationist women over half a century, this story exposes the endurance and shape-shifting capabilities of white resistance. As the story is reframed, three narrative threads bind it together. At the biographical level, the book traces the political trajectory of four very different white women who worked for a Jim Crow order. Second, the book examines the symbiotic relationship between legal and customary segregation through the work white women did in social welfare, education, electoral politics, and culture. They knew that daily work on multiple levels was needed to sustain racial segregation and to shape resistance to racial equality. A third theme charts the political diversity and various political alliances that segregationist women cultivated. These networks contributed to the rise of early opposition to the New Deal state and later support for the New Right, its far right wing, and national partisan realignments. These stories encourage us at a minimum to reconsider and perhaps cast aside several common practices, separating the limits of the civil rights movement from the persistent grassroots and often female-led organizing for white supremacy, segregating Southern segregationist women from national segregationist conservatives, and sparing nationally prominent conservatives the label of segregationists. They also suggest that when we focus too much on national legislative victories over legal segregation, we miss the endurance of white supremacist politics and practices in local institutions, in local communities. The political languages white segregationist women employed, in particular their experimentation with a colorblind conservative.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?